So the 1990s brought us this big explosion of interest, right? And so this is kind of, if you think about, what was happening in the 1990s, is this idea of the internet and, this perspective of looking at connectivity a different way. And so one perspective that was kind of a bigger started to gain interest around this time again is this idea of the connectionist approach, looking at connection through the networking. And so the connection approach has gone through several iterations and revamps across the decades. We can look at it kind of really starting honestly with Hebb's approach to neural networks, and then we can also kind of attribute Thorndike, who was one of the kind of early behaviorists looking at cause and effect of behaviors and how behavior is connected to consequence and things like that. This idea of cause and effect. And then, again, kind of taking different iterations, looking at now in this idea of brain and neural networks and looking at how the brain uses its cells to communicate as well as give us different experiences. And so this connection approach today and looking at it in terms of consciousness has taken a bit of a different kind of taste. Now, the 1990s also gave us this sort of second generation of cognitive science, and there's a lot of cognitive science approaches to consciousness today. And you can kind of see how, if you look at some of the literature, there was kind of this boom of writing about consciousness in the 1990s, and then again in the early 2000s, and again now you're seeing kind of these sort of 20-year gaps in some cases of theory and discussing about consciousness. And this really stemmed from the idea that, brains are always found in bodies are always in the environment. Let's look at the interaction between the physical and social sides of this. And so this is where it kind of brings us this idea of cognition as 4E. It's embodied, inactive, embedded, and extended. So just to kind of give you an idea of how this works. So when it comes to embodied, right? So we have a person and they have a brain in their head. Their brain and body can't be disconnected here, right? So the idea of being embodied, so we're going to say embodied here, okay, is this idea that that cognition can't just be described only in terms of representation. It's got to involve the entire body of the living system, and that includes both brain and body. So we have embodied right here. Now, if we think about inactive, now cognition is kind of looked at in a way that is an adaptive two-way exchange between biology and also phenomenological complexity of living creatures. So they also inhabit an environment and actively shape that environment. So you are, sort of in here in a house, right, in your tree, and you're interacting with different aspects of your environment. You are not isolated in a vacuum. So inactive is this idea of including the environment into this picture. When we talk about embedded means that you, again, are not separated from just this environment right here, right? There are other people, there are other animals, there are other things that that you have to consider, like physical, social, and cultural aspects of the world that are basically seen as layers. And so these are just kind of layers that are embedded within this idea of cognition. You are, affected by and affect your environment. You affect other people around you. You're impacted by lots of different things. So you're not separated from your ecological niche. And then finally, extended. Now, extended is interesting because thinking about sort of cognition being offloaded into other things, like, for example, your cell phone, right? So looking at your phone, if you have, for example, a calendar app, right, you are going to offload important dates and things that you need to help you extend your own mental processes. So you can't just rely on your own memory. Okay, you can tell a friend, hey, remind me to turn the oven off in 10 minutes, right? When we think about sort of offloading into different biological beings, meaning like other people or, even animals, having animals help us in our environment, doing things that would be impossible or just really difficult to do on your own. These are ways that we extend our cognition outward into other, parts of our environment. So this idea of extended is that kind of, if you think about these layers of our environment and our experience, kind of one of the outer portions of that, of offloading our own mental devices into others. So this really, gave us a perspective to think about. And I think that you're going to see a lot of this idea of cognitive approach, this connectionist approach in a lot of what we talk about in this class. So let's bring us back to defining consciousness. And at the very beginning, first day of class, I had you define consciousness. And then I had you think about your definition, okay? And I want you to think, do you believe that the definition that you chose on day one would be different from the definition that you're going to do on the last day of class? And I think that many of you probably will have some sort of idea or revision, because so many of you had revisions from day one, right, to day two, after talking with a partner, to day three of talking with another partner. These are things that influenced your ideas and made you rethink potentially maybe simplifying your definition, or maybe even make it more complex. So I'm interested in your thoughts and, how you think that you might actually change your definition again, because I'll have you do this exercise at the last day of class. And one thing that we've talked about a lot is, what is it about consciousness that makes it so difficult to define? What is it about this idea that is so difficult from person to person, from discipline to discipline, and even within disciplines, to define? And Dietrich would even say that there exists no accepted definition of consciousness. Every single time you go into a different textbook or go into a different discipline, you're going to see a different definition, and you're going to see a different element and set of elements in this definition. And what we find is that the more we learn, the less we know about consciousness. We think that we continue to learn more about the brain and about how it works, but then that just opens more questions. So how are we going to define consciousness for this class? We're going to have a very basic definition. So for example, a lot of definitions try to include some aspect of like communicating awareness, communicating to someone else or outward forces that you are aware or that you're having experience. But our textbook that we're going to use, which is Blackmore's text, is a very broad definition, and essentially defining consciousness as the subjective experience, also referred to as simply awareness. And so you don't necessarily have to communicate that awareness. You don't have to have sense of self. You don't have to have this high level of sentience. You just simply have to be able to be capable of subjective experience. You have to be able to be aware. So this is the definition that we're going to use, because this is how it's defined in the text. And I think this is a broad enough definition that can give us enough of a scope that includes pretty much any, possible situation. And, you might even look back to the definition that you ended up landing on, that was kind of like your revised definition, and ask yourself, what of these potential, like, possible elements of a definition that you included? So you may, at the end of this class, personally choose to define consciousness differently, and that's okay. But for the purpose of this class and testing, and if I ask you on an exam, I am expecting you to give me the definition that I've taught you, which is awareness or subjective experience. But you may personally decide later on that you broaden or make your definition more specific, because again, this is a personal, subjective kind of viewpoint. But for the purpose of this class, I've given you a definition that I expect you to use when asked, but know that, you might think about this later on in a different way. But when you consider what you might have included in your definition, a lot of people might include something like the subjective experience. be able to communicate awareness, right, back over to demonstrate that you're aware. So I don't know if you're aware unless you can communicate that to me. So that's really kind of where that stems from. Maybe some element of sensation, attention, emotion, feelings, perceptions, thoughts, intelligence is a really common one, as well as sense of self. And we've talked about this idea of sense of self. So this idea of sort of egocentrism, and so some of you might be familiar with this idea that you're being able to separate yourself from someone else. And so we've talked about this in terms of babies, right? So babies don't really have a sense of self. A lot of animals have not demonstrated a sense of self. You can use things like the mirror test to see if an animal can recognize itself in a mirror. We know that certain animals like elephants and dolphins pass that test, and so demonstrate evidence. Now, it's not the best test in the world, and of course it's not, I'm sure there's better ways to do this, but there's a lot of animals that would not be considered as having a sense of self. So if we think about these kind of pros and cons of a really broad versus a really specific definition, the more specific we get, the more we start to eliminate other organisms to be able to have what we would consider the conscious experience. So if you get super specific, right? If you say that an animal must have a high level of intelligence, or must have a sense of self, or must have the ability to have a moral compass, for example, you're starting to now eliminate different organisms off your list of having consciousness. And so if you say, well, I don't believe that rats are conscious, I don't think they have a subjective experience, I don't think that they are aware, I don't think that they have the ability to experience consciousness, then, that might change your treatment of rats. You may consider them as less than. You may consider that as, you can do whatever you want to them. Now, let's translate that to, okay, I don't think that babies have a sense of self. I don't think babies have a sense of intelligence. I don't think babies have the ability to demonstrate awareness at a high capacity. Therefore, that might actually change the way that you treat babies. It may change the way that you consider things like abortion. It's going to influence much higher level thinking when you consider how you view consciousness. So this is really, really important. If you have a really broad definition, you may be sort of leaning on more panpsychism. And then in that case, then you're saying, well, okay, now I can't eat anything. I can't even step on the grass because I'm worried that I'm going to cause it pain, right? So there are some pros and cons to having a broad versus a specific definition, but either way, I think if you go either extreme, you're going to have problems. And so we talked about, this idea of the hard problem. And so we're gonna kind of expand on that in just a minute, but this idea of the easy problem. So anything that we can solve empirically with empirical methods, the scientific method, would be considered, an easy problem. So for example, understanding computational or neural mechanisms, you can actually go in and see what the brain is doing. You can do sort of cause and effect experiments to see how that's working. If you look at attention, behavioral control, sleep-wake cycles, you can measure all of these empirically in a lab, and these are all associated with consciousness and not really, super mysterious. A lot of these can be easily tested, but the question is if you are able to solve these easy problems, does it give us enough information about consciousness to solve the hard problem? And what is the hard problem? How do physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience? What is it like to be a bee, a bird, a person? What is it like to be in a given mental state? What is it like to be happy? What is it like to be sad? What is it like to feel pain? So you might ask the question, do dogs feel pain? And is that subjective experience of pain the same kind of subjective experience that a human has? We will never be able to answer that question without jumping into the dog's body and experiencing that, right? Because it's a subjective experience, it's limited to the dog. So this kind of modern version of the mind-body problem of because philosophically, we've always asked this question: is your green my green? Is your experience my experience? Are you having a subjective experience? Looking out, and saying, does a squirrel have a subjective experience? These are all, this is the hard problem, and this is kind of that modern version of it. The question is if you solve those easy problems, will the hard problems disappear, or will it at least give us enough information to solve them? And neuroscientists seem to think so. A lot, they're like, well, what's the purpose of us studying this, is to try to understand the harder problems. But, not everybody believes that, because some of these are very philosophical questions. And a lot of times when we learn more and more about, test information about empirical methods, we're just simply asking more questions. We're just opening more questions. So the final thing that I want to talk about today is this idea of putting everything in context. So putting subjectivity in context. So how you think about consciousness, how you think about what animals or organisms or people are capable of thinking or experiencing is going to affect your thoughts on free will, on attention, on the unconscious, right? All of these things are going to impact this kind of level of what do we have control over? So what do we have control over? Sometimes you think, oh, attention, I have control over my attention. Well, sometimes there are things that will grab your attention even when you don't want it to. Right? You're like, oh, I don't want to look at that, but then you're looking at it, or there's a really loud noise and it scares you and you didn't want to attend to that noise, but it's there. This kind of idea of the subconscious, right? So experiencing things, being able to prime people with different ideas and thoughts and pictures and videos, and get them to act a certain way. And we're going to talk about priming behavior later. That's all kind of happening under the conscious level. When we think about what's required for consciousness, right? Do we have to freely determine what we're consciously aware of? Do we have choice and free will of what we are conscious of? Do we have to pay attention in order to be aware? And I think that what we're going to find later is that there's a lot of question there. That seems like a very easy answer, but it's not. Because we're going to find situations where there is awareness, but at a level that you're not able to communicate. What's important for consciousness? Do you have to have morals and ethics? Do you have to have a moral compass? Is high intelligence necessary? Does this organism have to think? We have evidence that bacteria can potentially make decisions. There's evidence of thinking there, but we don't see a brain. How are certain organisms able to make choices when, we don't seem to have the same kind of systems that would, the brain and nervous system of a human? How can we explain that? Another last thing I want to kind of point out is this idea of the conscious, unconscious, and subconscious. I'm going to talk about the sort of differences, and we're going to dive deep into those later. But we talked, we haven't really gotten into this, and we're not going to talk about Sigmund Freud too much. But some things that you might remember from other psychology classes is this idea of the id, which is that raw, natural, these are my desires and wants, and this is just completely natural and I have no control over that. And then we have the super ego, which is the kind of angel on your shoulder, and it's telling you, it's your compass, your conscious, this right here, this conscious, your ability to feel guilt and things like that. And then your ego, which kind of is the one that kind of communicates between the two. It's the one that is able to make good decisions and sometimes bad decisions based off of who's winning, the id or the superego. But Freud talked about your biological needs and desires, ideas of guilt and conscious, how you feel about certain situations. And there's so much that's under this iceberg, right? We're going to talk a little bit about this idea of the iceberg and consciousness and unconsciousness in a little bit further down the road. But this has kind of come back to this idea of awareness and consciousness. And so in cognitive psychology, this kind of cognitive unconsciousness is this sort of new unconscious, so what we used to talk about with Freud's unconscious. And this is idea of subliminal perception. So thinking and learning, memory without awareness, and being able to extend that to different emotions, motivations, behavioral factors and control. And we talk again, I'm going to talk about priming and how we can use priming to actually change a person's behavior that's sort of outside of their awareness. And so again, this brings us back to this idea of free will and choice, what you pay attention to, and how to kind of understand this level that so consciousness is sort of sitting right here, right? This is what you're aware of. There's something that's sitting kind of underneath consciousness, which we sort of refer to as the subconscious, or we call it the new unconscious here, which we'll get into a lot later on, but I just kind of want you guys thinking about this in context and how this is a complicated issue. But we will pick back up on neuroscience overview next class. I hope everybody has a great rest of your week.